I never imagined I'd be standing in an empty garage, staring at the vacant space where my restored 1967 Mustang should have been. The classic car I'd spent 3 years rebuilding with my own hands, gone without my permission, sold by my parents, to fund my sister Ellie's latest alternative healing retreat in Sedona. That moment crystallized everything: years of sacrifice, of being the reliable one, of watching my needs become optional while Ellie's wants became emergencies. But as I stood there, something unexpected happened. I felt a strange calm wash over me. This wasn't just about a car. This was about a lifetime of patterns that had to end. This is the story of how I reclaimed my life after years of being the family ATM and emotional support system, and how sometimes the most painful betrayals become the catalyst for your greatest transformation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The garage had always been my sanctuary. From the age of 16, I'd spent countless hours there, learning to work with my hands, finding peace in the methodical process of fixing what was broken. My father had taught me the basics before his promotion required more travel, leaving me to develop my skills largely on my own. The concrete floor was stained with oil marks that told stories of different projects, a timeline of my evolution, from novice to skilled mechanic. When I found the 1967 Mustang Fastback 3 years ago, it was barely more than a shell with an engine that hadn't turned over in a decade. The previous owner had kept it in a barn after inheriting it from his father, unsure what to do with it but unwilling to sell until he met someone who would treat her right. I spent 6 months convincing him I was that person, visiting regularly to discuss restoration plans until he finally agreed to sell it to me for $7,500. Every dollar I had saved from my engineering job since graduation. The restoration became my passion project. Every evening after work and most weekends found me in the garage, meticulously bringing the classic back to life. I sourced original parts from specialty dealers across 3 states, learned specialized painting techniques to achieve the perfect vintage Highland green finish, and rebuilt the engine piece by piece until it purred with a sound that made car enthusiasts turn their heads in appreciation. I documented every step, creating detailed restoration logs and posting progress photos in classic car forums where I'd built relationships with other restorers who provided invaluable advice. My parents had always been supportive of my hobby, as they called it, though neither really understood my passion. My mother would bring me sandwiches and coffee during long sessions in the garage, and my father would occasionally stop by to admire my progress, even if he couldn't tell a carburetor from a camshaft. "It's good to have something that's just yours," he'd say, patting me on the shoulder before returning to his ever-present work emails. The Mustang was more than just a car to me. It represented countless hours of learning, problem-solving, and personal growth. It was physical proof that with enough dedication and patience, I could transform something neglected into something extraordinary. The day I finally took it for its first real drive, windows down, engine rumbling beneath me, the smell of leather from the carefully reupholstered seats, was one of pure, uncomplicated joy. That was why finding the garage empty felt like having the air punched from my lungs. I had just returned from a week-long business trip to Chicago. The conference had gone well. I'd presented our team's new design to potential investors who seemed impressed with the innovations we'd developed. I was tired, but satisfied, looking forward to spending the weekend tinkering with the Mustang's sound system, the final touch in my restoration project. I'd even brought back a vintage knob for the radio that I'd found in a specialty shop in Chicago, carefully wrapped in tissue paper in my carry-on. The garage door hummed as it rolled up, the sound so familiar I barely registered it. But the silence that followed was deafening. Where the Mustang should have been, its green paint catching the afternoon light streaming through the side windows, there was only empty space. My toolboxes remained along the wall, and the special shelving I'd built for automotive parts still held various components for future projects. But the heart of the garage, my car, was gone. For a moment, I wondered if I'd been robbed, but there was no sign of forced entry, and nothing else was missing. I pulled out my phone to call the police when I noticed the envelope on my workbench, my name written in my mother's distinctive handwriting. My hands shook slightly as I opened it, and I still remember every word of the brief note inside. Jason, we needed to make a difficult decision while you were away. Ellie's doctor recommended an intensive healing retreat in Sedona that could really help with her anxiety, but insurance wouldn't cover it, and the spot had to be claimed immediately. We knew how much your car meant to you, but family has to come first in times of need. A collector offered $42,000, which covered Ellie's retreat and will leave enough to help her get back on her feet afterward. We know you'll understand once. You see how much this helps your sister. We'll talk when you get home. Love, Mom and Dad. I read the note 3 times, my mind struggling to process what had happened. They had sold my car that I had purchased with my own money, restored with my own hands, and kept in their garage only because my apartment complex didn't have secure parking. They had sold it without my permission, without even a phone call to discuss it. And they had done it for Ellie. Again. My sister had always been the fragile one in our family. 2 years younger than me, she had cycled through various diagnoses over the years. Depression, anxiety, chronic fatigue syndrome, each one becoming the center of family attention and resources. While I worked part-time through college to minimize student loans, my parents paid Ellie's full tuition at an expensive art school she ultimately dropped out of. When I saved for a down payment on a condo, half my savings went to cover Ellie's rent when she decided she couldn't work due to her energy sensitivities. When I got a promotion that required longer hours, I was gently reminded not to neglect family obligations, particularly spending time with Ellie, who needed the emotional support. And now, they had sold my car, the one thing that was undeniably, unquestionably mine, to fund another of Ellie's healing journeys. This one in Sedona, focusing on crystal therapy and sound baths, apparently the answer to the anxiety her previous treatments hadn't resolved. I stood in the empty garage for what felt like hours. The note crumpled in my fist, a storm of emotions, churning inside me. Anger, certainly. A white-hot rage that made my vision blur at the edges. Betrayal that cut deep and clean. Grief for the loss of something I had poured so much of myself into. But beneath these immediate reactions, something else was forming. A strange, calm clarity that I had never experienced before. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was the culmination of a pattern that had defined my entire life. I had always been the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who could handle disappointment and sacrifice because I was stronger than my sister. My needs had always been secondary. My achievements acknowledged but never celebrated with the same enthusiasm as Ellie's smallest steps forward. As the evening light faded from the garage, casting long shadows across the empty space where my Mustang should have been, I made a decision. This moment, this betrayal, would not be just another iteration of the familiar pattern. This would be the breaking point, the catalyst for change. I was done being the family resource, done having my boundaries ignored, done sacrificing my needs and wants for a sister who never seemed to progress despite endless treatments and healing journeys. I carefully folded the note and placed it in my wallet. Then I methodically turned off the garage lights, locked the door, and walked to my car, a practical sedan that served its purpose but had never been my passion project. As I drove away from my parents' house, I felt something shift inside me. The pain was still there, the anger still simmering, but alongside these emotions was something new. Determination. Determination to reclaim my life, to establish boundaries that would be respected, to ensure that this betrayal would be the last. I didn't know exactly what form this change would take, but I knew with absolute certainty that the dynamic that had defined our family for decades had just reached its endpoint. Whatever happened next would be on my terms, not theirs. The pattern that led to the empty garage began long before the Mustang, before my engineering degree, before my first job. It had roots in early childhood, in the subtle ways family dynamics establish themselves when no one is paying attention. I was 7 when I first noticed the difference in how my parents responded to our needs. I had come home from school with a fever of 101 degrees, wanting nothing more than to curl up in my bed with someone bringing me cold washcloths for my forehead. My mother had been sympathetic, but distracted. "Take some children's Tylenol and lie down, Jason. I need to help Ellie with her science project. It's due tomorrow and she's very stressed about it." I remember lying in my room, listening to my mother's patient voice guiding my sister through a project on the water cycle, complete with cotton ball clouds and blue cellophane water. My own science project the month before, a working model of simple electrical circuits, had been completed entirely on my own, after my father had explained he was too busy with work, and my mother had suggested that figuring it out yourself will be good for you. By age 10, I had learned to treat my own scrapes and minor illnesses, to help myself with homework, to manage my own disappointments. Not because my parents were neglectful, they weren't, but because Ellie's needs always seemed more urgent, more deserving of immediate attention. Her tears flowed more readily, her anxiety more visible, her struggles more dramatic. When Ellie failed a math test, it prompted family discussions about finding a tutor and reducing her stress levels. When I brought home straight A's, there was a pat on the back and a, "That's what we expect from you, Jason." Excellence became my baseline, with no celebration attached, while Ellie's smallest victories were treated as momentous occasions. Preparing. And narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Your sister processes things differently," my mother explained when I once asked why Ellie's B in English warranted a special dinner out while my perfect score on the state science competition received only a casual mention at breakfast. "She needs more encouragement to build her confidence. You've always been naturally confident." The truth was, I wasn't naturally confident. I had simply learned early that expressing needs or insecurities wouldn't yield results. Being self-sufficient was safer than being disappointed. So I became the child who could handle anything, who didn't need attention or praise, who understood when family resources were directed elsewhere. This pattern followed us into adolescence, where it intensified. When I turned 16, I received practical gifts, a scientific calculator for advanced math classes, new running shoes for track, a watch to help me keep my busy schedule. When Ellie turned 16 2 years later, my parents threw an elaborate party with professional decorations and hired a photographer, explaining that social connections are important for Ellie's emotional well-being. The summer before college, I worked 2 jobs, mornings at a local engineering firm filing papers and afternoons at a hardware store. I saved almost every dollar preparing for university expenses. That same summer, Ellie was enrolled in an arts program in New York, fully funded by my parents, who explained that developing her creative talents might help her find direction. College brought new dimensions to our family dynamic. I attended State University on a partial scholarship, working 20 hours weekly at the campus tech support center to cover remaining expenses. I chose my major, mechanical engineering, based on careful research into fields that would provide stable employment and good income. I lived in a cramped dorm room with a roommate who played video games until 3 a.m., but never complained because cheaper housing meant less debt. Meanwhile, Ellie enrolled in Westridge Arts Academy, a private college known more for its picturesque campus and nurturing environment than its academic rigor. My parents covered her full tuition and a private apartment near campus because, as my father explained, Ellie needs a peaceful space for her studies given her sensitivity to noise. I graduated in 4 years with honors and minimal student debt. Ellie switched majors 3 times and took 6 years to complete a degree in expressive arts therapy, accumulating substantial student loans that my parents helped repay because creative fields don't pay well initially, but they're so important for personal fulfillment. When I landed my first engineering job at Reynolds Design Group, I felt proud. The position was competitive, the company respected in the field, and the salary sufficient to begin building financial independence. I rented a modest apartment, bought professional clothing from outlet stores, and began saving for eventual homeownership. 6 months later, Ellie declared that traditional employment was too restrictive for her spirit and decided to become a freelance wellness consultant. With no clients and no business plan, she quickly ran into financial difficulties. My parents called me one evening, concern evident in their voices. "Jason, we need to discuss something as a family," my father began. "Ellie's having trouble making rent while she builds her client base. We're helping what we can, but with retirement approaching, we need to be careful with our savings." What followed was not a request, but an assumption. I would contribute $800 monthly to help Ellie get established. It wasn't presented as optional or temporary, but as my responsibility as the sibling who was doing well. I agreed, partly from genuine concern for my sister, partly from habit, and partly from the desire to be the son my parents could rely on. That first $800 payment became a monthly fixture for the next 2 years, even as Ellie's wellness business evolved into pottery making, then crystal jewelry design, then aura photography. Each venture beginning with enthusiasm and ending when the initial excitement waned, none generating sustainable income. During this time, I continued advancing in my career, earning promotions and raises through consistent performance and additional certifications I pursued on evenings and weekends. I finally moved into a condo I purchased with carefully saved funds, though the down payment was smaller than planned because of my ongoing support for Ellie. It was after this move that I found the Mustang and began the restoration project that would become my passion. The garage at my parents' house became my workshop, as my condo lacked suitable space. Every spare hour and dollar went into the car, which progressed slowly but steadily from rusted shell to gleaming classic. My parents seemed genuinely happy about my project, perhaps because it kept me close to home and available for family needs. My father occasionally reminisced about the cars of his youth, and my mother commented that it was nice to see me having a hobby instead of just working all the time. What they didn't fully grasp was that the Mustang represented something profound to me. It was the one area of my life that existed solely for my enjoyment, the one project where I didn't have to consider anyone else's needs or wants. When I was working on that car, I wasn't the responsible son, the reliable brother, the steady professional. I was simply a man rebuilding something beautiful because it brought me joy. Meanwhile, Ellie's cycle of enthusiasms and crises continued. There was the crystal healing certification that required an expensive course in Colorado, the emotional support dog that needed specialized training, the sudden move to a more energetically aligned apartment with higher rent. Each situation presented as an emergency requiring immediate family resources, emotional, financial, logistical. And each time, the family looked to me first, the one who had resources, who was stable, who could handle one more request. "It's just until she finds her path," my mother would say. "You're so blessed to have found yours easily." But I hadn't found my path easily. I had chosen it deliberately and worked consistently to build my career and stability. The difference wasn't luck or natural ability. It was approach and accountability. This wasn't something I could explain to my family without sounding resentful, so I mostly kept these thoughts to myself. I maintained boundaries where I could, limiting financial support to a fixed monthly amount, being unavailable for last-minute emergencies during important work projects, occasionally declining family gatherings to preserve time for my own friends and interests. These small acts of self-preservation were always met with subtle guilt. "Ellie was disappointed you couldn't help her move on Saturday," or "We missed you at dinner. Ellie was having a rough day and could have used your steadying presence." By the time I returned from that fateful business trip to Chicago to find my Mustang gone, I had spent 15 years as the family safety net. 15 years of having my achievements taken for granted while Ellie's smallest efforts were celebrated. 15 years of watching my needs become negotiable while Ellie's wants became imperatives. The empty garage space represented more than the loss of a car. It was the physical manifestation of a boundary violated, a sacrifice demanded without consent, a clear message that even something that was undeniably mine could be repurposed for Ellie's benefit if the family deemed it necessary. As I stood there that evening, processing what had happened, pieces of my life rearranged themselves into a pattern I could finally see with perfect clarity. This wasn't about a car, or even about Ellie. This was about a family system that had designated me as the provider and my sister as the recipient, roles so deeply ingrained that my parents felt entitled to sell my property without permission because it served the established dynamic. The realization wasn't just painful, it was liberating. Because patterns once recognized can be disrupted, roles once identified can be rejected, and dynamics, no matter how long-standing, can be changed. But only if someone is willing to break the cycle. I didn't confront my parents immediately after discovering the empty garage. Despite the anger pulsing through me, years of being the rational one had taught me to process emotions before acting on them. I drove to Lakeside Park, parked facing the water, and sat watching small waves lap against the shore while the reality of what had happened sank in fully. My phone buzzed repeatedly, texts from my mother asking if I was home yet, if I'd found their note, if we could talk. I silenced it and continued staring at the darkening horizon. This betrayal demanded careful consideration rather than an impulsive response. After an hour of reflection, I drove to my condo, took a long shower, and slept surprisingly well. The deep sleep that comes with certainty rather than confusion. In the morning, I called in to work requesting 2 personal days, something I'd rarely done in 6 years of employment. Then I messaged my parents. I'll come by at 2 p.m. to discuss what happened. When I arrived at their suburban ranch-style home, the house where I'd grown up, both of their cars were in the driveway. They had taken the day off work, too, recognizing the gravity of the situation they had created. I felt a twinge of bitter amusement. Even in their betrayal, they had made practical considerations. They wanted to handle damage control efficiently, minimizing disruption to their schedules. My mother opened the door before I could knock, her face a mixture of concern and defensive preparation. "Jason, honey," she began, reaching for a hug I stepped back from. Her arms dropped awkwardly to her sides. "We need to explain about the car. There are circumstances you don't understand." "I think I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice calmer than I had expected. "But I'd like to hear your perspective." The living room was arranged like a stage set for a difficult conversation. Coffee mugs on coasters, a plate of my favorite cookies on the coffee table, tissues strategically placed on the side table. My father sat in his usual armchair, looking simultaneously authoritative and uncomfortable. "Son," he began as I took a seat across from them, "we know how much that car meant to you. It wasn't an easy decision, believe me. But sometimes family has to come first." "The car was mine," I stated simply. "Purchased with my money, restored with my hands, kept here only because my condo doesn't have secure parking. What gave you the right to sell my property?" My mother leaned forward. Her therapist voice activated, the same tone she used when mediating family disputes or explaining difficult concepts to children. "Jason, Ellie has been struggling terribly since her breakup with Derek. Her anxiety attacks returned, worse than before. Dr. Winters suggested this retreat in Sedona. It combines traditional therapy with alternative healing approaches specifically designed for people with Ellie's sensitivity profile. The program had 1 spot open," my father added. "It had to be claimed immediately with full payment up front. Insurance wouldn't cover it because of the alternative components, even though Dr. Winters wrote a recommendation. We looked at all options, my mother continued. We considered taking out a home equity loan, but at our age with retirement approaching. She trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the implications. And this couldn't wait until I returned. From my business trip? This decision had to be made without even calling me? I kept my voice level, determined to understand their thinking process completely. My parents exchanged that familiar glance, the one they'd shared throughout my childhood when discussing Ellie situations. The timing was critical, my father explained. And frankly, Jason, we were concerned you might say no. This retreat could be transformative for your sister. After all these years of struggling, she might finally find the help she needs. Jacob Reeves, you remember him, the classic car collector from your father's office, had mentioned wanting to see your Mustang several times, my mother added. When this situation with Ellie came up, it seemed like providence. He offered far above market value because he'd been looking for that specific model and year for his collection. We intended to speak to you first, my father said, though his tone lacked conviction. But when the retreat called about the opening and needed an answer within hours. So you sold my car, I finished for him, without my permission, without my knowledge. We'll make it up to you, my mother promised quickly. Once Ellie's back on her feet, maybe we can help you find another project car. It won't be the Same, we know that, but I raised my hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Where is Ellie now? She left for Sedona yesterday, my father replied. The retreat is 3 weeks long, with limited communication allowed during the healing process. Did she know where the money came from? I asked. Did she know you sold my car to pay for this retreat? Another glance between them. My mother shifted uncomfortably. We told her we'd found a way to cover the costs. She was in such a fragile state, we didn't want to add any guilt or complications. Of course they hadn't told her. That would have disrupted the narrative of the supportive family rallying around Ellie's needs. No mention of the sacrifices extracted from others to maintain that support. Let me understand this completely, I said, arranging the facts methodically, as I would an engineering problem. You sold my personal property without permission while I was away on business. You used the funds, $42,000 according to your note, to send Ellie to another alternative treatment program. You didn't tell her where the money came from, sparing her any responsibility or awareness. And now you're offering vague promises about making it up to me at some undefined future point when Ellie is back on her feet, a condition that hasn't been met in the 15 years I've been supporting her. My parents looked taken aback, unaccustomed to hearing me frame family matters in such stark, transactional terms. When you put it that way, it sounds cold, my mother said, her voice tinged with disapproval. We're a family, Jason. Families support each other in times of need. Yes, they do, I agreed. I've supported this family consistently since I was 18 years old. I've contributed to Ellie's rent, her failed businesses, her therapy, her special diets, her emergency relocations. I've been the reliable one, the one who could be counted on when plans fell apart. And in return, you've taken my property without permission and acted surprised that I might object. My father leaned forward, his expression hardening slightly. No one forced you to help your sister all these years. You chose to do that because you care about her, because you're in a position to help while she isn't. That's what family does. I did choose to help, I acknowledged. But there's a difference between choosing to help and having decisions made for me, especially decisions about my own property. The car can be replaced, my mother said dismissively. Ellie's mental health can't. I thought you'd understand that distinction. Her words struck something fundamental in me. The car could be replaced? 3 years of work, countless hours of research and labor, the joy of bringing something back to life with my own hands, all reduced to a replaceable object when weighed against Ellie's latest crisis. "Where's the bill of sale?" I asked, my voice now deliberately businesslike. "I'll need it for tax purposes since it was my property that was sold." My parents seemed startled by the question. "Jacob handled the paperwork through his lawyer," my father said, looking uncomfortable. "We have a copy somewhere." "I'd like to see it now, please." My father hesitated, then went to his home office. I could hear him rummaging through drawers and papers. My mother watched me with concern, clearly sensing that something had fundamentally shifted in our relationship. "Jason, I know you're upset, and you have every right to be. But try to see the bigger picture. This retreat could be what finally helps Ellie turn the corner. Don't you want your sister to be well?" "Of course I want Ellie to be well," I replied, quietly. "I've wanted that for 2 decades. I've contributed thousands of dollars and countless hours toward that goal. But I've begun to wonder if our help is actually helping, or if we're just enabling a pattern that never changes." My father returned with a folder containing several documents. He handed me the bill of sale, which I reviewed carefully. The paperwork listed my father as the seller, with no mention of me as the actual owner. The sale price was $42,000 as they'd stated, paid via bank transfer to my parents' joint account. "This document lists you as the owner," I noted, my voice steady despite the fresh wave of anger washing through me. "The car was registered in my name. The original purchase receipt is in my name. All restoration parts were purchased with my credit card. How exactly did you represent yourself as the owner?" My father looked genuinely uncomfortable now. "Jacob knows me from work. He assumed, and I didn't specifically say." He trailed off, unable to complete the excuse. "You committed fraud," I stated simply. "You sold property you didn't own." "Now wait a minute," my father said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used when setting boundaries during my teenage years. "That's a serious accusation. We're your parents. The car was in our garage." "Location doesn't determine ownership," I replied. "The car was registered in my name. I have documentation proving I purchased and restored it. You sold something that wasn't yours to sell." "We were trying to help your sister," my mother interjected, her voice rising. "Not commit some kind of crime. This is ridiculous, Jason. We're talking about a car versus your sister's health." I folded the bill of sale and placed it in my pocket. "I'd like the contact information for Jacob Reeves, please." "Why?" my father asked suspiciously. "Because I need to speak with him about the car he purchased illegally." My mother's face paled. "You're not going to tell him the car wasn't ours to sell?" "Jason, that would create a terrible situation. He's your father's colleague." "Which is exactly why Dad shouldn't have misrepresented ownership," I replied calmly. "The contact information, please." My father reluctantly wrote down Jacob's phone number and email address. As he handed me the information, he attempted one more appeal. "Son, I know the car meant a lot to you, but it's just a possession. Family is what matters in the end. Your sister needs this help. Can't you find it in your heart to accept what's done and move forward?" I studied both my parents, the people who had raised me, who had taught me about responsibility and work ethic, who had shaped my understanding of family obligation. I saw not malice but a profound blind spot, a certainty that the established family hierarchy was natural and right. Ellie's needs would always come first. My role would always be the provider. They weren't cruel people. They simply couldn't see beyond the patterns established decades ago. "I'll be in touch," I said, standing to leave. "I need time to consider next steps." My mother rose quickly, distress evident in her expression. "Jason, please don't do anything hasty. Think about what this could do to the family. Think about Ellie." I turned at the door, looking at them both directly. I've spent my entire adult life thinking about what's best for this family, particularly what's best for Ellie. Now, I need to think about what's best for me. The door closed behind me with a quiet click, but it felt like the sound of something much larger ending and perhaps something new beginning. I didn't drive directly home after leaving my parents' house. Instead, I found myself heading toward River Point Cliffs, a scenic overlook about 30 minutes outside the city. During college, I'd often come here to think through difficult problems or decisions, finding that physical elevation somehow provided mental clarity as well. I hadn't visited in years, but my car seemed to remember the way, navigating the winding roads that led to the summit. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley below as I parked in the nearly empty lot. A few tourists snapped photos near the safety railings, but the viewing platform was otherwise deserted, a small mercy that allowed me the space I needed to process the day's revelations. From this height, the city where I'd spent my entire life looked both familiar and strange. I could see the general area of my parents' neighborhood, the downtown district where my office was located, even the vague direction of my condo. All, the physical locations that anchored my existence, visible in one panoramic view, yet somehow I felt completely dislocated from them, a spectator observing a life rather than a participant living it. I sat on a weathered wooden bench and tried to organize my thoughts. The engineering part of my brain wanted to approach this methodically, identify the problem, analyze contributing factors, develop potential solutions, evaluate outcomes. But this wasn't a mechanical issue to troubleshoot. This was my life, my family, my identity unraveling and reforming in real time. As I watched the changing light over the landscape, I began to see my situation from a perspective I'd never fully accessed before. I wasn't just Jason the reliable son, Jason the supportive brother, Jason the competent engineer. I was a complete person with legitimate needs, boundaries, and aspirations. A person whose property had been taken, whose autonomy had been violated, whose role had been reduced to that of a resource for others to use as needed. For perhaps the first time, I allowed myself to fully experience the anger without tempering it with understanding for my parents' perspective or concern for how my reaction might affect family harmony. I was justifiably furious. They had taken something precious that didn't belong to them. They had presumed rights they didn't possess. They had valued my sister's wants over my most basic ownership rights. And even in the aftermath, they expected me to prioritize family peace over personal justice. The realization was simultaneously painful and liberating. Painful to acknowledge how completely I'd allowed myself to be defined by my utility to others. Liberating to recognize that I could choose a different way forward. My phone vibrated with another text from my mother. "Please call us. We're worried about you. We need to resolve this as a family." As a family. The phrase struck me differently now, visible from this new vantage point. As a family had always meant according to the established hierarchy. Ellie's needs first, parents' concerns second, my considerations last. As a family meant maintaining the familiar patterns regardless of how unbalanced or unhealthy they might be. I silenced my phone again and continued gazing over the city as twilight approached. Lights began to flicker on across the urban landscape, creating new patterns against the darkening background. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Sometimes things need to grow darker before new configurations become visible. An elderly couple walked slowly past my bench, the man using a carved walking stick, the woman's hand resting gently in the crook of his elbow. They nodded politely as they passed, comfortable in each other's presence, their connection evident in the synchronized rhythm of their steps. I found myself wondering about their story. Had they always moved in such harmony, or had they navigated challenges and recalibrations throughout their years together? How many difficult conversations, boundary settings, and relationship reassessments had brought them to this point of easy companionship? The question led me to a new line of thinking. What would a healthy version of my family look like? Not the current dynamic where Ellie perpetually needed rescue and I was perpetually expected to provide it, but a balanced relationship between adult siblings and aging parents. What would it mean for all of us to relate to each other as full, separate people rather than interlocking parts of a dysfunctional system? The vision that formed was both appealing and foreign. Ellie taking genuine responsibility for her choices and their consequences. My parents acknowledging both their children's separate realities with equal consideration. Me expressing needs and setting boundaries without guilt or justification. All of us supporting one another when appropriate but never at the expense of individual dignity or autonomy. This vision wasn't a rejection of family bonds, but rather a reformation of them. Connections based on mutual respect rather than established roles. As I contemplated this possibility, I realized how far our current reality was from this healthier model, and how unlikely it was that my family would willingly undertake such a profound transformation. The tourists had departed now, leaving me alone on the overlook as darkness settled fully over the landscape. City lights created a constellation below, mirroring the stars that had begun to appear overhead. I stood and walked to the railing, feeling the cool metal beneath my palms as I leaned slightly forward, suspended between earth and sky. In that moment of literal perspective, standing above the city where my life had unfolded, seeing its entirety from a distance, something crystallized within me. This betrayal, painful as it was, offered a rare opportunity. It had created a break in patterns so long-standing I had stopped questioning them. It had provided the leverage needed to reassess and potentially reconstruct my family relationships on entirely new terms, or to walk away from them entirely if reconstruction proved impossible. The thought of estrangement from my family brought a sharp pang of grief, but also a curious sense of possibility. What would my life look like if I weren't constantly accommodating Ellie's crises? What resources, emotional, financial, temporal, would become available for my own dreams and aspirations? What relationships might flourish if I had more to give beyond what my family consumed? As I returned to my car, I felt different, more solid somehow, as if the perspective gained from physical elevation had translated to a new emotional grounding. The anger remained, but it had transformed from a reactive impulse to a clarifying force, illuminating what I valued and what I would no longer tolerate. The drive back to my condo took me past familiar landmarks, the high school where I'd excelled academically while Ellie struggled socially, the community college where I'd taken extra engineering courses during summers while Ellie explored various creative pursuits without completing any, the first apartment I'd rented after college where Ellie had stayed for 3 months during one of her transitions. Each location held memories of the established pattern, yet now I viewed them from a different vantage point, not as the reliable brother watching his sister's journey from the sidelines, but as an individual whose own journey deserved equal attention and respect. When I arrived home, I didn't immediately go inside. Instead, I sat in my car in the condo parking lot, making notes on my phone. Not the emotional venting of someone in crisis, but the strategic planning of someone reclaiming. Agency. I listed concrete actions, potential obstacles, necessary resources, and desired outcomes. The engineer in me approached personal liberation with the same methodical consideration given to professional projects, and something about this practical approach felt empowering. My first listed action: contact Jacob Reeves about the Mustang. Second, consult with a lawyer regarding the illegal sale. Third, freeze the financial support I'd been providing to Ellie. Fourth, research property storage options for my tools and remaining projects currently in my parents' garage. Fifth, schedule a session with Dr. Brenner, a therapist I'd seen briefly after a difficult workplace transition 2 years prior. Looking at this list, I felt a surge of determination. These weren't just reactions to betrayal. They were deliberate, steps toward reclaiming control of my resources, establishing clear boundaries, and creating space for healing and growth. They represented a departure from my habitual role as the family problem solver and a commitment to becoming the architect of my own life. I entered my condo with this new sense of purpose, noticing details I normally overlooked in my hurried comings and goings. The clean lines of the furniture I'd carefully selected. The collection of engineering books and classic car manuals arranged on built-in shelves. The framed photograph of the Mustang taken the day I'd completed the exterior. Restoration. The car gleaming in the sunlight, my own face reflected in the polished hood as I took the picture. That image, the car I'd lovingly restored, and my own reflection captured in its surface, seemed symbolic of something essential. The Mustang had been more than a hobby. It had been a mirror reflecting capabilities, patience, and passion that often went unrecognized in my family role. Its absence created an opportunity to examine what else might be reflected when I wasn't defined primarily by my utility to others. I prepared a simple dinner and ate at my kitchen island, continuing to make notes and refine my plan. By the time I finished eating, I had drafted an email to Jacob Reeves requesting a meeting to discuss an important matter regarding the 1967 Mustang Fastback recently purchased from the Carter family. I had researched attorneys specializing in property law and identified 3 to contact in the morning. I had calculated exactly how much financial support I had provided to Ellie over the past 5 years and transferred that information to a spreadsheet for future reference. These practical actions steadied me, creating a bridge between insight and implementation. It would have been easy to remain in emotional reaction, alternating between hurt, anger, and the familiar pull to maintain family peace at my own expense. Instead, I was channeling those emotions into concrete steps that would establish new patterns. As I prepared for bed, I noticed 3 missed calls from my father and another text from my mother. "We've been thinking about this all evening and realize we should have handled things differently. Please call when you can. We love you." The familiar words would once have prompted an immediate response, an assurance that all was forgiven, a return to the established dynamic. Now, viewed from my new perspective, I recognized them as the beginning of a well-worn path, acknowledgement without genuine understanding, apology without real change, reconciliation without restructuring of the underlying patterns. I didn't respond. Instead, I set my phone aside and stood at my bedroom window looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there was my Mustang, my parents' house, my sister's apartment, my office, all the physical locations that had defined my life. Yet from here, I could see beyond them to possibilities not yet materialized but now visible on the horizon. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations, practical challenges, and likely resistance from a family system accustomed to my compliance. But it would also bring the first steps toward a life reclaimed, a life where I was no longer defined by what I provided to others, but by what I chose to create for myself. That thought carried me into sleep more peacefully than I would have expected on such a tumultuous day. The strange serenity that comes not from the absence of conflict, but from the presence of clarity. Morning arrived with the clarity that often follows difficult realizations. I woke before my alarm, feeling unusually alert despite the emotional turbulence of the previous day. My engineering mind had been processing overnight, organizing the chaos of betrayal into manageable components that could be addressed systematically. I began my day with intention, following my normal routine with heightened awareness. The simple acts of making coffee, preparing breakfast, and organizing my workspace took on new significance, each one a small assertion of control over my environment when larger aspects of my life felt disrupted. At precisely 8 p.m., I called the office of Marion Walsh, a property attorney whose name had topped my research list the night before. After explaining my situation concisely to the receptionist, I was surprised to be offered an appointment that same afternoon. "Ms. Walsh has had similar cases," the receptionist explained. "She considers them priorities." My next call was to Dr. Brenner, the therapist I'd seen briefly 2 years earlier when workplace stress had begun affecting my sleep patterns. His measured, analytical approach had helped me navigate that situation effectively, and I hoped he might provide similar clarity now. Again, fortune seemed to favor decisive action. A cancellation had opened a slot for the following morning. With these appointments secured, I turned to the most challenging task on my list: contacting Jacob Reeves about the Mustang. I revised the email I'd drafted the night before, striking a tone that was professional rather than accusatory. The final version read, "Mr. Reeves, I'm writing regarding the 1967 Mustang Fastback you recently purchased from Robert Carter. I need to discuss some important information about this transaction that may affect your ownership rights. I am Robert's son, Jason Carter, and I can provide documentation proving that I was the legal owner of the vehicle, which was sold without my knowledge or consent while I was away on business. I would appreciate the opportunity to meet with you in person to discuss this matter and explore potential resolutions. I understand this situation is not of your making, and my goal is to find a solution that addresses the legal issues while respecting your position as a good faith purchaser. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to arrange a meeting. Sincerely, Jason Carter." I hesitated before pressing send, knowing this email would set in motion events that couldn't easily be reversed. Once Jacob understood the car had been sold fraudulently, there would be no returning to the status quo with my family. This was a decisive step away from the pattern of accommodation that had defined my relationships for decades. I sent the email, then immediately turned to practical matters to channel the surge of adrenaline that followed. I researched storage facilities that could accommodate my toolboxes and automotive equipment currently housed in my parents' garage. I found 3 promising options within reasonable distance of my condo and scheduled visits for later in the week. Next, I created a comprehensive inventory of my financial entanglements with my family. Beyond the monthly support for Ellie, there were several shared accounts and arrangements that needed disentangling. A joint family cell phone plan I'd been managing for years, streaming service subscriptions used by all family members but billed, to my credit card, the informal agreement that I would cover major home repairs for my parents in exchange for using their garage space. The picture that emerged was sobering. Over the past 5 years alone, I had contributed over $84,000 to support my sister and parents in various ways. Funds that could have gone toward my own home purchase, retirement savings, or even a more extensive workshop space where I could have stored my car safely. This wasn't money I expected or wanted returned. It had been given freely, if under certain emotional pressures. But seeing the total quantified so starkly helped solidify my resolve. The financial asymmetry was simply one tangible manifestation of the broader imbalance in our family dynamic. My exploration of finances led naturally to consideration of my own goals and priorities, aspects of my life that had often been subordinated to family needs. What did I truly want for myself, independent of my role as supportive son and brother? The question felt simultaneously basic and profound, like a familiar room suddenly viewed from an unexpected angle. I opened a new document on my laptop and began listing dreams and aspirations I'd set aside or never fully articulated. 1. Purchase a house with dedicated workshop space. 2. Start a side business restoring classic cars. 3. Take advanced certification. Courses in automotive design. 4. Travel to the major international auto shows. 5. Perhaps most surprisingly, explore dating more intentionally, with an eye toward building a partnership rather than the casual relationships I'd defaulted to because they required less time and emotional investment. Looking at this list, I realized how thoroughly family obligations had shaped my choices. I'd selected my condo primarily for its proximity to my parents' home, making it easier to respond to Ellie's frequent crises. I'd limited my travel to essential business trips, remaining consistently available for family needs. I'd restricted my restoration work to a single project at a time, knowing that more ambitious undertakings would require resources often diverted to family support. The scope of these accommodations became clearer as I continued my assessment. My life had been constructed around availability and reliability for others, with my own aspirations fitted into whatever space remained. The Mustang had been my one significant act of self-prioritization, and even that had ultimately been sacrificed to the established pattern. At noon, I received a reply from Jacob Reeves. "Jason, your email is concerning, to say the least. I've known your father professionally for many years and would never have proceeded with the purchase had I any indication the car wasn't his to sell. I'm available to meet tomorrow at 10 a.m. at my office, address below. Please bring whatever documentation you have regarding ownership. Regards, Jacob Reeves." His prompt response suggested he took the matter seriously, which was encouraging. I confirmed the appointment immediately, then continued preparing for my meeting with the attorney. By the time I left for Marion Walsh's office, I had assembled comprehensive documentation of my ownership. The original purchase receipt for the Mustang, registration documents, insurance policies, detailed restoration logs with dated photographs, documenting my work, receipts for parts and materials purchased over 3 years, and even social media posts and forum discussions where I'd shared progress updates. Ms. Walsh's office occupied a converted Victorian home in the historic district, its exterior charm contrasting with the efficiently modern interior. The attorney herself matched this juxtaposition. A woman in her 50s with a traditional suit and pearl necklace paired with vibrant blue-framed glasses and a direct manner that dispensed with unnecessary pleasantries. "Unauthorized sale of personal property by family members is more common than you might think," she said after reviewing my documents, "particularly with items of significant value that family members feel some entitlement to, either due to shared space or misguided notions of communal ownership." "What are my options?" I asked, appreciating her straightforward approach. "Several, depending on your ultimate goal," she replied, organizing my documents into neat stacks as she spoke. "Your ownership documentation is excellent, meticulous. Really, there's no question the vehicle belonged to you, both legally and through the sweat equity of restoration." She outlined 3 potential paths. First, pursue criminal charges against my parents for fraudulent sale of property, which would likely result in the sale being voided and the car returned to me. Second, pursue civil action to recover the full market value of the car, which she estimated could exceed the $42,000 sale price given the quality of the restoration. Third, negotiate directly with the buyer for either return of the vehicle or additional compensation, leveraging the threat of legal action but potentially avoiding actual court proceedings. Before we determine which approach best serves your interests, Ms. Walsh said, I need to understand your priorities. Is recovering the specific vehicle most important to you? Maximizing financial compensation? Establishing legal accountability? Or preserving some form of family relationship while still addressing the wrong done to you? Her question cut to the heart of my decision-making process. What did I truly want from this situation? The Mustang itself held tremendous personal value. 3 years of work, countless hours of problem-solving and craftsmanship, the satisfaction of bringing something beautiful back to life. But this wasn't just about a car. It was about boundaries violated and respect denied. I want the car back, I said after careful consideration. But more importantly, I want acknowledgement that what happened was wrong. Not just inconsiderate or unfortunate, but fundamentally unacceptable. And I want to establish boundaries that prevent similar situations in the future. Ms. Walsh nodded, making notes. In that case, I recommend starting with the third approach, direct negotiation with Mr. Reeves, whom you're meeting tomorrow. If he's a collector who purchased in good faith, he may be open to returning the vehicle once he understands the circumstances, particularly if facing potential legal complications with the title transfer. She continued outlining a strategy that balanced assertiveness with pragmatism, suggesting specific language to use in my meeting with Jacob, and potential compromises that might facilitate resolution without immediate escalation to legal proceedings. "What about my parents?" I asked. "They're not acknowledging the seriousness of what they did. They keep framing it as a family matter rather than a legal issue." "That's common in these situations," she replied. "Family members often use the language of family obligation to obscure what would otherwise be recognized as clear violations of basic rights. My suggestion is to maintain separation between the recovery process with Mr. Reeves and any reconciliation process with your family. Resolve the property issue first, then address the relationship dynamics from a position of greater strength." Her advice resonated with my own instincts. Attempting to simultaneously recover my property and reform family patterns would likely result in emotional arguments that obscured the fundamental legal and ethical issues. As our meeting concluded, Ms. Walsh handed me her card with her direct number written on the back. "Call me immediately after your meeting with Reeves. We'll adjust our approach based on his response." I left her office feeling more centered than I had since discovering the empty garage. The legal framework she provided offered structure for addressing the immediate problem of the car, while her observations about family dynamics validated my broader concerns about patterns that needed changing. On the drive home, I noticed how differently I was processing this situation compared to previous family conflicts. Instead of absorbing impact and adjusting to accommodate others' actions, I was establishing clear boundaries and pursuing specific resolutions. Instead of prioritizing family harmony above personal justice, I was acknowledging both as legitimate considerations requiring balanced attention. This shift felt fundamental, not just a temporary reaction to exceptional circumstances, but a recalibration of how I engaged with my family and by extension with myself. The emptiness of the garage had revealed the emptiness of a role I'd played for too long, the endlessly accommodating son and brother whose needs remained peripheral to the family narrative. As I prepared for tomorrow's meeting with Jacob Reeves and the subsequent conversations with my family, I was guided not just by anger at a specific betrayal, but by a deeper commitment to establishing new patterns of engagement based on mutual respect, rather than established roles. The Mustang had become both literal and metaphorical, a vehicle I had restored with care and commitment, only to have it taken without consent. But in its absence, I was discovering the framework for something perhaps more valuable, a sense of self not defined primarily by utility to others, but by the integrity of my own boundaries and aspirations. The morning of my meeting with Jacob Reeves dawned clear and crisp, a perfect autumn day that seemed incongruous with the weighty conversation ahead. I dressed with deliberate care, not in my usual business casual attire, but in a formal suit I typically reserved for client presentations. This wasn't about impressing Jacob so much as embodying the seriousness with which I approached the situation. The polished shoes, precisely knotted tie, and tailored jacket served as external armor for the internal resolve I was still cultivating. My phone had accumulated 7 missed calls from my parents overnight, along with a series of increasingly concerned text messages. The latest, sent at 5:47 a.m., revealed they had somehow learned about my meeting with Jacob. "Jason, Mr. Reeves from Dad's office called this morning. He says you're claiming we sold your car without permission. Please, don't do this. We can work things out as a family without involving outsiders. Call us immediately." The message confirmed what I had suspected. My parents had misrepresented ownership to Jacob, likely describing the Mustang as a family car, or perhaps even directly claiming it as my father's project. Their concern now wasn't primarily about the moral implications of their actions, but about potential embarrassment and complications in my father's professional relationships. I didn't respond to the message. Instead, I reviewed my documentation one final time, ensuring everything was organized in the leather portfolio Ms. Walsh had suggested using. "Presentation matters in these situations," she'd advised. Then I drove to the address Jacob had provided, an office building in the financial district where he apparently managed his investment portfolio and car collection as a post-retirement enterprise. His office occupied the entire top floor, decorated, with a tasteful mixture of automotive memorabilia and contemporary art. Model cars in glass cases shared space with abstract sculptures. Vintage racing posters hung alongside modern paintings. The reception area featured a glass wall overlooking a climate-controlled showroom where several classic cars gleamed under strategic lighting. My Mustang wasn't visible from this vantage point, but I felt its presence nonetheless. A gravitational pull from somewhere beyond the viewing area, the connection between creator and creation transcending physical separation. Jacob himself emerged from an inner office precisely at 10:00 a.m. He was older than I had expected, late 60s or early 70s, with silver hair and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent significant time outdoors. Despite his age, he moved with surprising energy, extending his hand for a firm handshake as he introduced himself. "Jason Carter," he said rather than asked. "You look like your father. Same eyes, same posture. Though I don't recall him ever mentioning. You were a car enthusiast." "That's part of what we need to discuss," I replied, maintaining eye contact. "Thank you for meeting with me on short notice." He gestured toward his office, a corner space with windows on two sides providing expansive views of the city. "Your email suggested this is a sensitive matter. I appreciate your directness in reaching out." Once seated, I opened my portfolio and placed my driver's license on his desk. "Before we begin, I want to confirm my identity. I'm Jason Carter, Robert Carter's son. The documentation I'm about to share relates to a 1967 Mustang Fastback Highland Green, which you purchased 3 days ago." Jacob nodded, studying my license briefly before returning it. "Yes, a beautiful vehicle. The restoration work is exceptional. Factory authentic with subtle modern improvements for drivability. I've been searching for that specific year and color combination for some time." "I performed that restoration," I said quietly. "Every component, every decision, every hour of labor was mine over the past 3 years." Jacob's expression shifted, slightly, a subtle recalibration as he processed this information. "Your father didn't mention that. He spoke as if the car had been in his possession for many years." "It was in his garage," I acknowledged, "but only because my condo doesn't have secure parking. The car has always been registered in my name. I purchased it, restored it, insured it, and maintained it." I presented the documentation methodically: original purchase receipt, registration, insurance cards, dated restoration photographs, parts invoices, forum discussions where I had detailed the rebuild process. Jacob reviewed each document with careful attention, asking occasional clarifying questions. "This is quite comprehensive," he said finally, leaning back in his chair. "Based on this documentation, it's clear you were the legal owner of the vehicle. Which raises the obvious question: how did it come to be sold by your father?" This was the moment of truth, the point where I would have to explicitly name what had happened rather than using euphemisms or family-friendly interpretations. Ms. Walsh had emphasized the importance of clarity in this conversation. "My parents sold my car without my knowledge or consent while I was away on business," I stated, my voice steady despite the emotion beneath the words. "They used the proceeds, $42,000 according to the bill of sale, to finance an alternative therapy retreat for my sister, who has ongoing health concerns. When I returned and discovered what had happened, they confirmed they had not consulted me before making this decision." Jacob's expression darkened. "That's highly irregular, to say the least." "It was theft," I said, using the word my attorney had emphasized, "followed by fraudulent sale of property. My parents had no legal right to sell the vehicle, regardless of their intentions for the proceeds." The bluntness of my statement hung in the air between us. Jacob tapped his fingers thoughtfully on his desk, his gaze shifting to the view outside before returning to meet mine. "I've known your father professionally for 15 years, he said finally. "I would never have imagined him capable of misrepresenting ownership in a transaction of this magnitude." I believe they convinced themselves it was justified because the money was going to help my sister, I replied. But justification isn't the same as legal right. Jacob nodded slowly. I understand you must be angry. Justifiably so. What are you seeking from our conversation today? This was the question. I had prepared for most carefully, balancing legal rights with practical realities and my own emotional needs. First and foremost, I want my car returned, I said directly. It represents 3 years of my life and craftsmanship that can't be reduced to a dollar value. Second, I want acknowledgement that the sale was invalid and resulted from misrepresentation. I'm not looking to create problems for you. You purchased in good faith, but I cannot allow this situation to stand uncorrected. Jacob was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back as he gazed outward. When I collect cars, he said without turning, I'm not merely acquiring objects. I'm preserving history, craftsmanship, and vision. The vehicles in my collection have stories, design innovations, racing heritage, cultural significance. He turned to face me. Your Mustang caught my attention because of the quality of its restoration. Whoever had rebuilt it clearly understood not just the mechanics but the soul of that particular model. It wasn't merely repaired, it was honored. His use of the phrase, your Mustang, rather than the Mustang, didn't escape my notice. Now I learn that the person who created that work had their creation taken without consent, Jacob continued. That violates everything I value about automobile preservation and collecting. He returned to his desk and pressed a button on his phone. Angela, please prepare the paperwork to reverse the purchase of the 1967 Mustang, and have Thomas bring the vehicle to the viewing room. Relief washed through me, though I maintained my composed exterior. Thank you for understanding the situation. Don't thank me, Jacob replied seriously. I'm simply correcting a transaction that should never have occurred. Your documentation is irrefutable, and frankly, I want no part of a vehicle acquired, under such circumstances, regardless of its quality or desirability. He studied me with renewed interest. You must be quite skilled to have completed that level of restoration. Most enthusiasts your age are focused on modern modifications rather than period-authentic rebuilds. I believe in respecting the original engineering while making thoughtful improvements where appropriate, I said, allowing my passion for the work to show through. The Mustang deserves restoration that honors its design legacy. Our conversation shifted to technical aspects of the rebuild, challenges I had overcome, rare parts I had sourced, modifications I had incorporated to enhance performance while maintaining period aesthetics. For 15 minutes, we connected simply as enthusiasts sharing appreciation for automotive craft, the legal complications temporarily set aside. This interlude was interrupted by a gentle knock at the door. The vehicle is ready in the viewing room, Mr. Reeves, a voice announced. Jacob stood. Let's complete this resolution properly. He led me through a security door into the climate-controlled showroom I had glimpsed earlier. 6 vehicles were arranged in the space, each on a slightly raised platform with dedicated lighting. A 1955 Mercedes 300 SL Gullwing, a 1963 Corvette. Split window, a 1970 Jaguar E-Type, a 1958 Porsche 356 Speedster, a modern Ferrari F40, and, at the far end, my Mustang. Seeing it again, the perfect curve of the fastback roofline, the deep Highland green paint that shifted subtly under different lighting angles, the precisely restored interior visible through the windows, I felt a complex surge of emotions. Relief at finding it unharmed, pride in the work I had completed, lingering anger at how it had been taken, determination that such a violation wouldn't happen again. As we approached, Jacob gestured to a man in a crisp uniform who appeared to be his collection manager. Thomas, Mr. Carter will be taking the Mustang today. Please ensure all documentation is properly reversed and see that his vehicle is detailed before departure. Thomas nodded. Will do, sir. The paperwork is being prepared now. Should be ready in about 30 minutes. Jacob turned to me. While we wait, there's something I'd like to discuss with you. Would you join me for coffee in my office? Back in his private space, after his assistant had brought espresso in delicate cups, Jacob regarded me thoughtfully. Your restoration work is exceptional, he said without preamble. I rarely encounter that level of craftsmanship in hobbyists, or even in many professional shops. Thank you, I replied, unsure where this conversation was heading. I maintain relationships with several specialized restoration facilities across the country, he continued. I'm always seeking talented people who understand how to preserve automotive heritage while making vehicles drivable for modern collectors. He slid a business card across the desk, not his standard card, but one with a private number handwritten on the back. If you're ever interested in turning your skill into something more than a hobby, call that number. I can facilitate introductions to people who would value your approach and attention to detail. The offer caught me off guard. I appreciate that, but I have a career in engineering. Many things can be careers, Jacob replied. The question is which ones speak to your particular combination of talents and passions. Just something to consider. Our conversation continued as we waited for the paperwork, touching on car values, restoration techniques, and the philosophy of preservation versus modification. Throughout, I maintained the clear, direct communication style that had characterized my approach since discovering the empty garage. No deflection, no minimizing of my knowledge or accomplishments, no automatic deference to someone older or more established. When Thomas returned with documents indicating the sale had been reversed and the full amount refunded to my parents' account, I reviewed everything carefully before signing. The final page included a statement that I was the rightful owner taking possession of my property, with Jacob's signature acknowledging the reversal of the invalid transaction. What will you tell my father? I asked as we completed the process, the question unavoidable given their professional connection. Jacob's expression was somber. The truth, that I've returned the vehicle to its rightful owner after learning it was sold without proper authorization. How he explains that to colleagues or family is his concern, not mine. As we walked back to the showroom where my Mustang waited, keys now on the driver's seat, Jacob added, For what it's worth, I suspect your parents convinced themselves they were acting in your sister's best interest. People can rationalize remarkable transgressions when they believe the cause is worthy. Intent doesn't change the fact that it was wrong, I replied quietly. No, he agreed, it doesn't. But understanding motivation can sometimes help navigate the aftermath. I thanked him for his handling of the situation and promised to consider his offer regarding restoration work. Then, after a final inspection confirmed the car was exactly as I had left it, I slid into the familiar driver's seat, inserted the key, and felt the engine rumble to life with its characteristic blend of vintage power and carefully tuned precision. As I drove away from Jacob's building, the Mustang responding to my touch like a reunion between old friends, I reached a decision. This recovery wasn't just about reclaiming property. It was about declaring a fundamental change in how I would engage with my family moving forward. Before returning to my condo, I made one significant stop, a storage facility I had researched the previous day, where I arranged immediate rental of a climate-controlled unit large enough to accommodate the Mustang and my tools. Within an hour, I had transferred my car to its new secure location, protecting it from further unauthorized decisions made in my absence. Only then did I compose my response to my parents' increasingly urgent messages. Not a hasty text or emotional phone call, but a carefully crafted email that would serve as my declaration of change. I have recovered my Mustang through direct communication with Jacob Reeves, who immediately returned the vehicle upon reviewing documentation of my ownership. The full purchase amount has been refunded to your account. This situation has made several things clear to me. 1. My boundaries have not been respected in our family dynamic. 2. My property rights have been violated in a way that cannot be dismissed as a simple misunderstanding. 3. Major decisions affecting my possessions and investments have been made without my consent. Effective immediately, I am establishing the following boundaries. I will be removing all my remaining tools and projects from your garage this weekend. I am discontinuing the monthly financial support I have been providing to Ellie. I'm stepping back from family involvement until we can establish new patterns of interaction based on mutual respect. This is not a hasty reaction, but a necessary recalibration of relationships that have become unbalanced. I remain open to rebuilding connections on healthier terms in the future, but that process cannot begin until there is acknowledgement of the serious breach of trust that has occurred. Jason. I read the message 3 times, ensuring it expressed clear boundaries without descending into blame or accusation. Then I pressed send, the action feeling momentous, a declaration of independence from patterns that had constrained me for too long. Whatever happened next would unfold on fundamentally different terms than the dynamics that had defined our family for decades. The garage was empty no longer, and neither was the space within me that had too often been filled with others' priorities rather than my own. The response to my declaration came more swiftly than I had anticipated. Within 20 minutes of sending the email, my phone began ringing. First my mother, then my father, then Ellie herself, calling from the retreat that was supposedly limiting outside communication. I let each call go to voicemail, determined to maintain the boundaries I had just established. This wasn't about avoiding difficult conversations, but about ensuring they occurred on terms that acknowledged my autonomy rather than presuming my availability. The voicemails accumulated, each revealing different facets of my family's reaction to the shifting dynamic. My mother's message was emotional, her voice wavering between indignation and pleading. Jason, you can't just cut off communication like this. We're your family. Yes, we made a mistake with the car, but to threaten withdrawing support from your sister who's struggling. That's not the son we raised. Please call us so we can fix this misunderstanding. My father took a more authoritative approach. Son, I understand you're upset about the car situation. That's fair, but involving my colleague and making legal threats is taking this too far. We need to discuss this as a family, not escalate it into something that could have professional repercussions. Call me back immediately. Most surprising was Ellie's message, which arrived despite the retreat's supposed communication restrictions. Jason, Mom and Dad just called, completely freaking out. They said you're cutting me off financially? Over a car? I know you loved that thing, but I'm working on my mental health here. This retreat is really helping me. I don't understand why you're punishing me for something Mom and Dad did. We need to talk. Each message reinforced my decision to establish distance before engaging further. None acknowledged the fundamental violation that had occurred. All framed my response as an overreaction or unjustified escalation. Most tellingly, each positioned me as the problem, the one disrupting family harmony rather than responding to a significant breach of trust. I spent the remainder of the day in methodical action rather than reactive emotion. I contacted my bank to cancel the automatic transfer that had been sending $800 monthly to Ellie's account. I called the family cell phone plan provider and arranged to separate my line into an individual account. I created a detailed inventory of items I needed to retrieve from my parents' garage and scheduled a moving company to assist with the larger pieces. These practical steps provided structure amid emotional turbulence. Each completed task represented another thread of unhealthy entanglement severed, another aspect of independence reclaimed. By evening, I had addressed most of the logistical aspects of my disengagement, creating space to process the personal dimensions of this transformation. As I prepared dinner, cooking properly for the first time in weeks rather than grabbing something quick between work and family obligations, I reflected on how rarely I had prioritized such basic self-care. Simple acts like preparing nutritious food, maintaining my living space, or pursuing personal interests had consistently been compressed into whatever time remained after meeting external expectations. My phone continued signaling incoming messages throughout the evening. My parents' attempts grew increasingly urgent, while extended family members began appearing in my notification list. My mother's sister expressing concern about family troubles, my father's brother asking why my parents were so upset, my cousin wondering if everything was okay. The family system was mobilizing, the established patterns scrambling to reassert themselves in the face of disruption. I silenced my phone entirely and focused on immediate priorities. Tomorrow would bring my appointment with Dr. Brenner, the therapist who had helped me navigate workplace challenges. I wanted to approach that conversation with clear objectives rather than scattered reactions. Sleep came more easily than expected, the deep rest of someone who has made difficult but necessary decisions rather than the fitful slumber of ongoing uncertainty. My dreams featured open roads and the sound of a well-tuned engine, images of movement and freedom rather than confinement. Dr. Brenner's office hadn't changed since my previous visits 2 years earlier. The same landscape paintings on pale blue walls, the same comfortable chairs arranged to facilitate conversation without confrontation, the same subtle scent of lavender from the diffuser on his bookshelf. The familiarity was grounding as I prepared to discuss profound changes in my life circumstances. Brenner himself remained the thoughtful, analytical presence I remembered. A man in his mid-50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a precisely trimmed beard that had more silver than when I last saw him. He began by reviewing our previous work together, then asked what had prompted my return. I recounted the events of the past 3 days concisely, from discovering the empty garage to recovering the Mustang and declaring new boundaries with my family. Brenner listened without interruption, occasionally making notes but maintaining steady eye contact that acknowledged the significance of what I was sharing. "What strikes me immediately," he said when I finished, "is the clarity you've maintained throughout this situation. Many people would be overwhelmed by the emotional aspects of such a betrayal, but you've approached it with remarkable self-possession." "It doesn't feel that way internally," I admitted. "There's still anger, hurt, disbelief." "Of course there is," he nodded. "Those emotions are entirely appropriate responses to what happened. What's notable is that you're experiencing those feelings without being controlled by them. You're making decisions based on clear assessment of boundaries violated rather than reacting from pure emotion." His observation helped me recognize something important. The methodical approach I'd taken wasn't emotional suppression, as my family might characterize it, but rather emotional integration. I was acknowledging the feelings while not allowing them to dictate my actions. "What concerns you most about the path forward?" Brenner asked after we had discussed my immediate reactions in greater depth. I considered the question carefully. 2 things primarily. First, maintaining the boundaries I've established when my family inevitably pushes against them. Second, determining what kind of relationship might be possible in the future, if any. "Those are insightful concerns," he affirmed. "Let's address the first one, maintaining boundaries. What specific pressures do you anticipate from your family system?" "They'll try different approaches based on what's worked in the past," I replied, recognizing patterns more clearly as I articulated them. "My mother will appeal to family obligation and worry about Ellie's well-being. My father will invoke authority and concern about appearances. Ellie will express hurt and incomprehension about why her healing should be affected by something between you and our parents. Extended family will start reaching out about why I'm causing problems during such a difficult time for Ellie." Brenner nodded, appearing impressed by the clarity of my assessment. "You understand their likely strategies with remarkable precision. What's been your typical response to these approaches in the past?" "Eventual capitulation," I acknowledged. "I might establish temporary boundaries or express frustration, but ultimately I'd return to the established role, the reliable one who puts family needs first, who understands that Ellie needs more support, who doesn't make waves. And what's different now that might help you maintain your position despite these familiar pressures? This question required deeper reflection. What had fundamentally changed beyond the specific incident with the car? I think I finally recognized that the pattern isn't temporary, I said, articulating a realization that had been forming since standing in the empty garage. This isn't about getting through a difficult period until things normalize. This is the normalization of imbalance, a permanent dynamic where my needs will always be secondary to Ellie's, where my resources will always be considered available for redistribution, where my boundaries will always be negotiable in service to the established family narrative. Brenner leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. That's a profound insight, recognizing that what you've been treating as situational is actually structural. How does that recognition affect your approach moving forward? It changes everything, I replied, feeling the truth of this as I spoke. If I believed this was a temporary aberration, I might focus on resolving the immediate issue while maintaining the underlying relationship structures. But recognizing it as a fundamental pattern means the relationships themselves require restructuring, not just addressing specific incidents. Our conversation continued in this vein, exploring strategies for maintaining boundaries in the face of predictable pressure tactics. Brenner suggested specific responses to anticipated arguments, ways to recognize when I was being drawn back, into established patterns and techniques for distinguishing between genuine relationship repair and superficial reconciliation that preserved underlying imbalances. What about your second concern? He asked as our session neared its conclusion. Determining what kind of relationship might be possible in the future? That feels less clear, I admitted. Part of me wonders if real change is possible given how entrenched these patterns are. That's a valid question, Brenner acknowledged. Family systems are remarkably resistant to fundamental change because they organize themselves around established dynamics. When one member alters their participation in those dynamics, the system typically exerts significant pressure to restore familiar patterns rather than adapting to new ones. So you're saying change isn't likely? The possibility felt both discouraging and liberating. I'm saying system-wide change requires more than one person's transformation, he clarified. You can absolutely change your participation in the dynamic. Whether others choose to adapt to that change or continue attempting to pull you back into established patterns remains to be seen. And if they don't adapt? Then you'll face difficult decisions about what level of engagement is possible while maintaining your boundaries and well-being. Those aren't decisions you need to make immediately. For now, focus on establishing and holding your boundaries consistently. The system's response to those boundaries will provide important information about what futures are possible. As our session ended, Brenner made an observation that would stay with me in the days ahead. What's most striking about your approach is that you're not acting from vindictiveness or punishment, but from a genuine recognition that the existing patterns aren't sustainable or healthy for anyone involved, including your sister. True support doesn't enable dependency, it fosters growth toward greater capability and responsibility. I left his office feeling more centered than when I'd arrived. The path forward remained challenging, but I had greater clarity about both, the dynamics at play and my own capacity to navigate them. Most importantly, I recognized that maintaining boundaries wasn't selfish or uncaring, but necessary for authentic relationship rather than role performance. When I checked my phone in the car, I found 17 new notifications. Voicemails, texts, emails from various family members. Rather than feeling overwhelmed by the onslaught, I felt confirmed in my assessment. The system was indeed mobilizing. All available resources to pull me back into established patterns. I didn't respond to any of the messages immediately. Instead, I drove to a local coffee shop, ordered an Americano, and found a quiet corner where I could review the communications, thoughtfully rather than reactively. The messages revealed exactly the pressure tactics I had anticipated: guilt, appeals to family obligation, assertions that Ellie couldn't handle losing financial support, suggestions that my response was disproportionate to the triggering event. Most notably, none acknowledged the fundamental violation that had occurred or recognized my right to establish boundaries around my property and resources. All positioned me as creating a problem rather than responding to one. With this confirmation, I composed a single clear message to be sent to each family member who had contacted me. I understand this situation is causing concern. I've made my position clear regarding both what happened and what needs to change moving forward. I'm taking time to process recent events and am not available for further discussion until my stated boundaries are acknowledged and respected. I'll reach out when I'm ready to engage further. I sent this response to each message, then turned my attention to the afternoon ahead. The moving company would arrive at my parents' house at 3 p.m. to help retrieve my remaining tools and projects from their garage. I had deliberately scheduled this for a time when both parents would typically be at work, hoping to complete the task without confrontation. As I drove toward my parents' house, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: determination, sadness, anxiety, relief. The practical act of removing my possessions represented a tangible step toward independence, a physical manifestation of the boundaries I was establishing. Whatever happened next, I would be operating from a foundation of greater autonomy, with my resources and creations securely under my control rather than vulnerable to others' decisions. The house came into view as I turned onto the familiar street, the single-story ranch where I had grown up, where I had learned to use tools in the garage that would soon be emptied of my presence. The sight prompted unexpected emotion, not just anger at recent betrayals, but genuine grief for the simplicity of childhood, when I had believed in the security of family bonds without questioning their terms or conditions. As I parked across the street, steeling myself for the task ahead, I noticed something unexpected: my father's car in the driveway, though he should have been at work midday on a Thursday. This deviation from routine suggested deliberate planning rather than coincidence. My father had arranged to be home during the scheduled moving time, ensuring the retrieval of my possessions wouldn't occur without engagement. The boundary I had established was about to face its first direct challenge. How I responded would set the tone for all that followed. For a moment, I considered rescheduling the moving company and avoiding the confrontation altogether. The familiar impulse to postpone difficult interactions, to maintain peace at the expense of progress, surfaced automatically. But I recognized this reaction as part of the old pattern and deliberately chose differently. I pulled into the driveway, behind my father's car, parking with deliberate precision. The moving truck would arrive in 20 minutes. I would use that time to establish the terms of this interaction, rather than allowing the old dynamics to reassert themselves. Taking a deep breath, I exited my car and approached the front door with measured steps. Before I could ring the bell, the door opened. My father stood in the entryway, his expression a carefully composed mixture of authority and conciliation, the face he had presented throughout my childhood when he believed discipline needed to be tempered with understanding. "Jason," he said, his tone neutral, "I thought we should talk before you remove your things." "I have movers arriving in 20 minutes, I replied, maintaining eye contact. "We can talk briefly, but my decision to retrieve my possessions isn't negotiable." He stepped aside to allow me entry, a small concession that acknowledged the changed dynamic between us. The living room was arranged much as it had been for our previous conversation, the furniture positioned for serious discussion, coffee mugs waiting on coasters. My mother was conspicuously absent. "Your mother's at work," my father explained, noticing my glance around the room. "She wanted to be here, but I suggested this conversation might be more productive with just the two of us." I took a seat in the armchair rather than on the couch where I would typically sit, A small but deliberate choice that positioned me as an equal participant rather than a subordinate one. What would you like to discuss? My father sat across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, his characteristic posture when attempting to convey sincerity. First, I want to acknowledge that selling the Mustang without your permission was wrong. We should have consulted you, regardless of the circumstances. The acknowledgement, while significant, addressed only the action rather than the underlying pattern. I nodded, but remained silent, waiting for him to continue. That said, I'm concerned about the extent of your response, he proceeded, shifting from acknowledgement to qualification. Cutting off financial support to your sister, removing all your possessions, limiting communication with the family, these steps seem disproportionate to a single mistake, however serious. It wasn't a single mistake, I replied evenly. It was the culmination of a pattern that's existed for years, one where my boundaries are considered optional, my resources are viewed as communal, and my needs are consistently subordinated to Ellie's. My father's expression tightened slightly. That's an unfair characterization of our family dynamic. We've always supported both you and your sister according to your different needs. Ellie has struggled in ways you haven't. Ellie has been permitted to struggle, I interrupted, surprising both of us with my directness. She's been allowed multiple fresh starts, endless healing journeys, financial bailouts, and emotional accommodations without corresponding expectations for growth or responsibility. Meanwhile, I've been expected to function as a supplementary parent, providing financial support, emotional stability, and practical assistance whenever called upon, with my own needs and boundaries treated as secondary considerations. My father straightened, his expression shifting toward the stern authority he had rarely directed at me in adulthood. You make it sound calculated, as if we've deliberately exploited you. We're talking about your sister, Jason, your family. Families support each other through difficulties. Yes, they do, I agreed. But support should foster growth and capability, not perpetual dependency. It should recognize and respect boundaries rather than assuming unlimited access to resources. And most importantly, it should be reciprocal rather than consistently flowing in one direction. A moment of silence stretched between us as my father seemed to genuinely consider these points. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted subtly. I won't pretend to fully understand your perspective, he said more carefully. But I can see that from your viewpoint, certain patterns have become problematic. What would addressing these concerns look like from your perspective? Surely not permanent estrangement from your family. The question was reasonable. The first, indication that he might be willing to engage with the substance of my concerns rather than simply attempting to restore the status quo. I considered my response carefully. Addressing these concerns would begin with genuine acknowledgement of the patterns I've described, not just regret about the Mustang incident. It would involve respecting the boundaries I've established rather than treating them as negotiable or temporary. And most fundamentally, it would require rethinking how our family approaches Ellie's ongoing challenges, shifting from indefinite support without accountability to more sustainable approaches that encourage her growth toward greater self-sufficiency. My father rubbed his hand across his face, a gesture I recognized from moments when challenging work problems required him to reconsider established approaches. These aren't simple changes you're suggesting. They affect fundamental aspects of how our family functions. Yes, I acknowledged. That's precisely why they're necessary. The current functioning isn't sustainable or healthy. Not for me. Not for you and Mom, and ultimately, not for Ellie either. Before he could respond, the doorbell rang, the moving company arriving exactly on schedule. The interruption seemed symbolic somehow, a physical manifestation of the new boundaries being established. I need to direct the movers, I said, standing. They'll be taking my tool chests, equipment, and project materials from the garage. My father nodded, rising as well. I'll unlock the side entrance so they can access it directly. As we walked toward the garage, he asked the question that I suspected had been his primary concern all along. What about Ellie's financial support? She's counting on that money for when she returns from the retreat. Her rent, utilities, basic expenses. She doesn't have alternate resources right now. This was the crux of the matter, the practical implication of boundary setting that would have immediate consequences for the family system. I've calculated that I've provided over $47,000 in direct financial support to Ellie over the past 5 years, I replied as we entered the garage. That doesn't include uncounted meals, transportation, or emergency assistance. Going forward, I'm investing those resources in my own priorities and goals. And what about Ellie's immediate needs? My father pressed, his concern genuine even as it revealed the deeply ingrained expectation that I would continue indefinitely as a financial safety net. Ellie is 30 years old, I said simply. She has a college degree, no physical disabilities that prevent employment, and parents who have consistently supported her. If she can't meet basic expenses through her own efforts and your assistance, then perhaps the approach we've been taking isn't working and requires fundamental reconsideration rather than continued reinforcement. My father seemed about to argue further, but was interrupted by the arrival of the moving crew at the side entrance. For the next hour, we maintained a business-like interaction as the movers efficiently packed and removed my belongings. The professional-grade tools I had accumulated over years, specialized equipment for automotive restoration, parts and materials, for future projects. My father occasionally pointed out items he thought might be mine, ensuring nothing was left behind. As the last items were being loaded into the truck, he asked quietly, "Where will you set up your new workshop?" "I've rented a climate-controlled storage unit for now," I explained. "Eventually I'll look for a house with garage space, but that's a longer-term plan." He nodded, a flicker of genuine interest showing through his concern. "You've always been good with your hands, better than I ever was. I remember how surprised I was when you rebuilt that old lawnmower engine when you were just 14. The memory caught me off guard, a rare acknowledgement of my specific talents rather than my general reliability. You taught me the basics, I acknowledged, the patience to approach problems methodically. A moment of connection flickered between us, quickly subsumed by the tensions of the present situation. The moving foreman approached for a final signature, confirming all items had been retrieved. As the truck pulled away, my father and I stood in the now emptier garage, the space no longer containing physical manifestations of my projects and passions. The emptiness felt appropriate somehow, a visible representation of the shifts occurring in our relationship. "What happens now?" my father asked, his tone more subdued than earlier. "Now I continue establishing the boundaries I need for a healthier engagement with the family," I replied. "I'll be maintaining distance while I process recent events and determine what kind of relationship is possible moving forward. And if your mother and I want to be part of that process, if we want to understand your perspective better and address these patterns you've identified?" The question seemed genuinely open rather than merely strategic, a tentative step toward acknowledging that change might be necessary, rather than simply managing my reaction to return to the status quo. That would begin with respecting the boundaries I've established, I said. Not pressuring me to resume financial support for Ellie, not treating my decisions as up for family debate, not mobilizing relatives to convince me I'm overreacting. If you're genuinely interested in addressing the patterns, I'd recommend working with a family therapist who specializes in adult family systems. I'd be willing to participate in that process when I'm ready, but not immediately. My father absorbed this information with a thoughtful expression. "I can't speak for your mother or Ellie, but I'm willing to consider what you're saying, not promising immediate agreement, but genuine consideration." This modest commitment, not to immediate change but to genuine reflection, represented more openness than I had anticipated. It wasn't resolution, but it was a small step toward potential transformation, rather than mere damage control. As I prepared to leave, my father asked one final question. "The car, your Mustang, you got it back?" "Yes," I confirmed. "Mr. Reeves returned it after reviewing documentation of my ownership. It's secure now." He nodded, something like respect flickering across his expression. "You handled that efficiently, directly." A pause, then. "I'm sorry we put you in that position." The apology, while limited to the specific incident rather than the broader pattern, seemed genuine. I acknowledged it with a nod before departing, the interaction having gone differently than I had anticipated. Neither complete resistance nor immediate capitulation, but rather the first tentative steps toward potential recalibration. As I drove away from my parents' house, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: the gravity of meaningful change, the uncertainty of an evolving relationship, the satisfaction of boundaries maintained despite pressure to compromise. Most significantly, I felt a growing sense of agency, not just in response to what had happened, but in deliberately shaping what would happen next. The moving truck would deliver my possessions to the storage facility within the hour. My Mustang was already secured there, protected from further unauthorized decisions. My financial resources were being redirected according to my priorities rather than family expectations. My time and attention were increasingly my own to allocate. These weren't merely reactive measures in response to betrayal, but proactive steps toward a life reconfigured according to my own values and boundaries. The empty garage that had initially symbolized violation now represented something different. Space cleared for new possibilities, new arrangements, new ways of engaging with both my passion projects and my family relationships. As I merged onto the highway, heading toward the storage facility where I would meet the movers, I felt something unexpected beneath the complexity of emotions, a sense of anticipation, of forward momentum not defined primarily by what I was leaving behind, but by what might lie ahead. The storage facility manager greeted me with professional courtesy when I arrived to meet the moving truck. "Mr. Carter, we've prepared your unit as requested, climate-controlled, with the extra electrical outlets installed this morning for your equipment needs." I thanked him as he guided me through the security gate toward a sizable corner unit separated from the standard storage spaces. The facility had worked quickly to accommodate my requirements, converting what had been a small office space into a functional, if compact, workshop environment. The concrete floors had been freshly sealed, ventilation upgraded, and lighting enhanced to support detailed work. "Your vehicle arrived yesterday, correct?" the manager confirmed, consulting his tablet. "Yes, the '67 Mustang," I replied, feeling a small surge of satisfaction at having my car secure and officially documented in my name in their system. "Beautiful restoration work," he commented as he unlocked the large roll-up door. "My father had a similar model when I was growing up. Never in that condition, though." The compliment, offered casually by someone with no stake in my family dynamics, felt refreshingly straightforward. Before I could respond, the moving truck rumbled into view, and we shifted to the practical business of directing the unloading process. Over the next 2 hours, I organized my equipment methodically, tool chests positioned for optimal workflow, parts inventory arranged on industrial shelving, specialty equipment secured in designated areas. The space wasn't ideal for actual restoration work, lacking the square footage of a proper garage, but it would serve as adequate interim storage while I developed longer-term plans. As the movers departed and I made final adjustments to the layout, my phone vibrated with an incoming call from a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I might have let it go to voicemail given the events of recent days, but something prompted me to answer. Jason Carter speaking. "Mr. Carter, this is Thomas Westfield from Reeves Collection." The voice was professional, clearly the collection manager I had met at Jacob's showroom. "Mr. Reeves asked me to follow up with you regarding a matter we discussed yesterday." I recalled. Jacobs offered to connect me with restoration specialists, though I hadn't expected such prompt follow-up. "Yes, I remember. There's a situation that's developed which Mr. Reeves thought might interest you," Thomas continued. "One of the restoration facilities he partners with in Markham Heights has had an unexpected staffing change. Their lead, restoration specialist, has taken a position overseas with very little notice, leaving them with several significant projects in progress." Markham Heights was an upscale suburb about 30 minutes from my condo, close enough to commute easily, but removed from my immediate neighborhood and family connections. "What exactly did Mr. Reeves suggest regarding this situation?" I asked, curious but cautious. "He mentioned your exceptional work on the Mustang and suggested you might be interested in consulting on these projects while they secure a permanent replacement. The facility director, Ms. Eleanor Vega, would like to meet with you tomorrow if possible. The position would be temporary initially, 3 months, but with potential for extension or permanent arrangement depending on mutual interest." The proposal caught me completely off guard. I had always approached restoration as a passionate hobby, not a professional pursuit. My engineering career provided financial stability and intellectual challenges I valued. Yet, something about this unexpected opportunity resonated precisely because it diverged so completely from my established path. "I'm not currently looking to change careers," I said carefully. "I have a full-time position in engineering." "Mr. Reeves mentioned that," Thomas replied smoothly. "Ms. Vega is willing to discuss flexible arrangements that might accommodate your current employment, weekend work, evening hours, or project-based consultation. She's primarily interested in your specific expertise with vintage American muscle cars, which apparently is in short supply among qualified restoration specialists at the moment." I found myself intrigued despite my initial hesitation. What would this initial meeting entail? A tour of the facility, review of the projects currently in progress, and discussion of possible arrangements. No commitment required at this stage, purely exploratory. I considered the proposal carefully. My instinct for caution warned against taking on new commitments during an already turbulent period. Yet another part of me recognized this as potentially more than just an additional responsibility. It represented a completely different direction, one unconnected to family expectations or established patterns. "I can meet tomorrow afternoon," I decided. "I'll need the address and a contact number." For Ms. Vega. After arranging the details and ending the call, I stood in my newly organized storage space, surrounded by the tools and equipment that represented years of developing skills I had always categorized as just a hobby. The possibility that these same skills might have professional value beyond my personal projects shifted something in my perception, not just of the opportunity before me, but of how I had classified my own capabilities. Throughout my life, my mechanical abilities had been acknowledged but subtly minimized within the family narrative. A nice hobby, a useful skill for practical tasks, but never quite on par with my real work in engineering or Ellie's perpetually evolving creative pursuits. I had internalized this categorization without questioning it, prioritizing my technical career while treating my restoration work as secondary, despite the profound satisfaction it provided. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.